Richard Hoagland and Linda Eisler lived what seemed to be an idyllic life in Indianapolis, Indiana. The couple had 2 sons, Douglas and Matthew. Richard's business was thriving, and the couple lived an extravagant lifestyle. They lived in a 5-bedroom home with a speedboat tied up at a nearby lake and a closet filled with designer clothes. The couple had minor arguments, but nothing major, and everything seemed to be fine. However, in 1993, Richard started being distant from his family. He started staying in his room for hours alone. Linda believed that he may have been suffering from depression, but decided to give him some space. On February 10, 1993, Linda was at work when Richard called her and told her that he wasn't feeling well and that he had to go to the emergency room. Linda offered to accompany him to the ER, but he told her that he did not want to wait. Later that day, she picked up Douglas, her son, from daycare and returned home, but could not find her husband Richard anywhere. She called the local hospitals, but Richard had not been admitted to any of the ERs. All of his belongings, including his passport, clothes, and driver's license, were still at the house. Less than an hour later, Richard called Linda and said, quote, "I can't live this way anymore. I feel you would be better off without me," and hung up the phone. He would later call again and say, quote, "I don't want to go to jail. I'm never coming back," before hanging up the phone. Those were the last words that Linda heard from her husband. Linda reported her husband missing to police that same day. A few days later, police found Richard's car at the Indianapolis airport. However, no man by the name of Richard Hoagland boarded any of the flights on the day of his disappearance, nor the days after that. Police traced the last 2 phone calls that Richard had made. One call was made from Venezuela, and the other from Aruba. During that summer, Richard sent a letter with a $50 bill in it to his son Matthew for his 10th birthday. He sent another letter and another $50 bill to his son Douglas on his 7th birthday. This was the last time that anyone heard anything from him. For the next 2 decades, Richard remained missing and never contacted his family. Police investigated Richard and found out that he had been struggling financially and had never told his wife. He had maxed out all of their credit cards and had taken out quite a few loans. After Richard left, the family struggled financially. Linda was unable to pay for their car or their mortgage. Police also started suspecting Linda in Richard's disappearance. They believed that she knew her husband's whereabouts, but she was adamant that she had nothing to do with her husband's disappearance and gained nothing from his absence. Linda was devastated after Richard's disappearance and had to depend upon her own parents to get by, both financially and emotionally. Linda, in an interview, said, quote, "He devastated us. He left us with nothing, absolutely nothing. I was very broken." Linda filed for a divorce. The judge granted her a divorce in absentia and ordered that Richard would be the one to pay off all of the debts. However, he never returned. The absence of their father affected both Matthew and Douglas. It was particularly hard for Douglas, who became addicted to drugs and landed in prison multiple times. Richard was declared dead 10 years later, and Linda remarried and got her life back together. Then, in 2016, Linda was contacted by a detective from the Pasco County Sheriff's Department in Florida. The detective asked her if she knew a man named Richard Hoagland. She told them that that was her ex-husband, who had gone missing in 1993. The detective told her that they had found him and that they had him in custody. It turned out Richard Hoagland had been alive all of these years. After he disappeared in 1993, abandoning his wife and children, Richard fled to Florida, where he rented a room from a man named Edward Szymanski, whose son, Terry Szymanski, had drowned in 1991. Richard stole the death certificate for Terry Szymanski from the house and decided to steal his identity. Using Terry's death certificate, Richard applied for a birth certificate, and using the birth certificate, he got a driver's license. He bought a house in Zephyr Hills, Florida, and married a woman named Mary, who had no idea about his past life. The couple would go on to have a child together. Richard would live under the name Terry Szymanski for 2 decades, until one day in 2016, when the real Terry Szymanski's nephew started looking around Ancestry.com, the truth was revealed. Terry Szymanski's nephew had been doing research on his family history when he came upon records of a Terry Szymanski who was still alive. However, he knew Terry Szymanski had died in 1991. He realized that someone was impersonating his dead uncle. However, he was afraid that if he reported them, the impersonator might do harm on the family, so he did not do anything for 3 years. But in 2016, he could no longer sit quietly and notified police. In July of 2016, Richard was arrested. He initially claimed that he was Terry Szymanski and provided the officers with a birth certificate and a driver's license. But when the police showed him Terry Szymanski's death certificate, he confessed that he had been impersonating him for 2 decades. He said that he left Linda and his sons because he did not want to live with his family anymore. Authorities wanted to charge him for the various crimes he committed. However, the statute of limitations for them had already expired. He was eventually charged with identity theft in 2017 and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Linda sued Richard for $1.8 million in unpaid child support and won. It's unclear, though, how Richard would be able to repay her, as his current assets in Florida are tied to the divorce proceedings involving his second wife, Mary. Michelle Whitaker was one of 5 children born to Laura Andrews on August 16, 1969. Michelle was described as somebody with a big heart and loved her family. During her teenage years, however, Michelle started to rebel as she believed her mother was too strict. Michelle would later get married right after graduating high school to a man that she met while training to join the Navy. The marriage was abusive and lasted for less than a year. She would start drinking, and by the time she was 30, she had been married 3 times and also arrested several times for public intoxication. In 2002, she was arrested for drunk driving and completed her jail sentence. In early August of 2002, Michelle had an argument with her mother, Laura Andrews, and stormed out of the house. This was the last time her mother saw her. A few days later, Laura got a call from a man that Michelle had been living with. The man told her that he had not seen her for 3 days. Laura immediately contacted police, but was told that Michelle was an adult and that there was nothing that they could do. Laura then decided to seek help from a friend who was a police officer named Sergeant Alan Woods. On the 21st of August, 2002, a missing persons report was finally filed. Police checked Michelle's phone records and her bank records, but nothing came of it. The day before she had gone missing, Michelle had been bar hopping and had met a man named Brad Wines. Police interviewed Brad, and he told them that he and Michelle had a couple of drinks and then went to another bar. Brad recalls that Michelle then went back to his home with him, and the next morning she asks Brad to take her to a truck stop. Brad says that she then told him that she was going to Myrtle Beach, and that this was the last time that he ever saw her. Police gave Brad a polygraph test, which he passed. Police searched the Myrtle Beach area looking for Michelle, while her family and friends distributed flyers, but to no avail. The case would eventually go cold. Then, 3 years later, in 2005, police received an anonymous letter in which the author claimed that Michelle had been murdered and her body had been buried 25 miles from the truck stop in Landrum. The police searched the area with cadaver dogs, but found nothing. The police believed that the letter was most likely a sick prank. In 2005, a man named Jonathan Vick was arrested for the murder of Dana Statterfield, a beauty salon owner who was brutally murdered in 1995. Vick was also suspected in the disappearance of his ex-girlfriend, Heather Sellers. Police then uncovered that Heather Sellers was the co-worker of Michelle at the Waffle House. Suspicions immediately fell upon Vick. He was questioned, but denied anything to do with Michelle's disappearance. Vick was eventually sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Dana Statterfield. He was never charged with the disappearance of Heather Sellers or Michelle Whitaker. Then in 2008, 6 years after Michelle's disappearance, police received a call from a woman who recognized Michelle Whitaker from an episode of Forensic Files and a picture from a missing persons website. The woman said that Michelle Whitaker was alive and well and was living in Oregon. The woman sent a picture of Michelle to the police department, and sure enough, it was a photo of Michelle Whitaker. An officer went to Oregon, where Michelle had been living, and confirmed that the woman in the photo was indeed Michelle Whitaker. Police told her that her family had been looking for her for the past 6 years. Michelle said that she left because she was sick of her life. She believed that she was causing too many problems for her family and that her family would be better off without her, not realizing the pain and stress that she had put her family in for the last 6 years as they looked for her. She said that after Brad dropped her off at the truck stop, she took a ride to Las Vegas and then went to California and eventually Oregon. She claimed she had no idea that her family had been worried sick looking for her for all these years. She was eventually reunited with her family. Benjamin Harris Todd was a stockbroker, and Dorothy Lee Barnett was a flight attendant when they got married in 1991. However, the relationship was quite turbulent. Benjamin claimed that Dorothy would often have mood swings and would explode regarding minor issues. Benjamin, in an interview, said, quote, "I never knew what was going to face me when I came through the door after work. It could be nothing, and it could be nothing but screaming and yelling and throwing pots." The marriage would eventually crumble, and both filed for a divorce. However, Dorothy was pregnant at the time of the divorce. On May 6, 1993, Dorothy would give birth to a baby girl named Savannah Todd. What followed was a bitter divorce and custody battle for the daughter. Dorothy told the court that she was a better fit for her nursing daughter. However, Benjamin questioned his ex-wife's mental health. Both parents fought hard for primary custody of the child. The court ordered Dorothy and Benjamin to undergo psychiatric evaluation. While one psychiatrist ruled Dorothy as mentally healthy, the other psychiatrist and 2 psychologists diagnosed her with bipolar disorder. However, several psychiatrists hired by Dorothy's legal team countered that she did not have any mental disorder. The judge would eventually side with Benjamin and gave him full custody of Savannah Todd. Dorothy was given visitation rights every second weekend. During one of her scheduled visits on April 22, 1994, Dorothy picked up Savannah from Benjamin's mother's house and disappeared. Just days after she disappeared, Dorothy sent a video message to her family, saying, quote, "Savannah and I belong together and nobody besides God has a right to destroy that." This would be the last time Dorothy and Savannah were heard from again. For years, Benjamin spent every resource he had trying to find his daughter. The case was featured on multiple television shows, but to no avail. For years, Savannah remained missing. Then, in 2011, a couple emailed Benjamin that they knew the whereabouts of Dorothy and Savannah. The couple was living on the Sunshine Coast in Australia and claimed that for the past 12 years, they had known Dorothy and Savannah. Benjamin contacted the FBI, but it would take 2 more years before Dorothy was arrested, as authorities had to work with Australian authorities in order to get provisional warrants. It was found that before she disappeared, Dorothy had gotten a fake birth certificate with the name Alexandria Marie Canton, and using that document, she got a Texas driver's license and passport. She used the fake passport to travel to France. She then spent time in Germany, Malaysia, Singapore, and eventually made her way to South Africa. While there, she met a man named Juan Haldenice. She fell in love with him and married him in 1995. Dorothy became known as Alex Haldenice, and Savannah as Samantha Haldenice. The couple would go on to have a son. They would eventually move to New Zealand and later made their way to Australia. Dorothy and Juan Haldenice would eventually separate. Dorothy was arrested in 2013 and extradited back to Charleston, South Carolina. At the time, Savannah was away studying at a university, pursuing nursing studies when she got the news about her mother's arrest. The news came to her as quite a shock, as she'd always believed that Juan Haldenice was her biological father. In an interview, Samantha said that she still loves her mother and that nothing has changed between them. She said in regards to her mother, quote, "She is the most important thing, and she was, and she always has been, and she still is." Savannah also said that she did not believe the claims by her father Benjamin that her mother suffered from bipolar disorder, saying, quote, "I've never ever seen anything like that in my entire life. She's not got a mental illness. She's not violent, unless she's done this whole 180 and changed her entire attitude. Then it's not who she is." Dorothy pled guilty to kidnapping and passport fraud. She was sentenced to 21 months in prison and 2 years of supervised release. Savannah, now known as Samantha Haldenice, met with her biological father, and she hopes to continue to maintain a relationship with him in the near future.